Corsair,
Apple floppy days,
Commodore,
Tandy floppy days,
Atari,
TI floppy days. The weekend comes, the disk drive hums, ready to code for you. These days we're all happy and free.
those floppy days,
The games we play, you shared with me.
those days,
Motorola, Intel 6502, graphics and text are there to view. Composite, color, or RGB, program fun for you and me.
Floppy Days is recorded in a live studio.
Inside PC floppy days, ST Amiga floppy days, Junior Sinclair floppy days, classic days, microwaves, geeking all week with you. These days we're all happy and free.
those floppy
The
days,
games we play, you shared with me.
those days,
These floppy days are yours and mine. These floppy days are yours and mine. Floppy days.
The TRS-80 Model III.
Introducing the Apple IIc.
Atari 1040 ST.
Commodore 64. What?
PC Junior, new from IBM.
Discover Atari. It's his Radio Shack Color Computer 3. Introducing the Timex Sinclair 1000.
For computer, this is the one. Texas Instruments home computer.
A wonder computer of the 1980s. The Commodore VIC-20.
Hello and welcome to episode 142 of the Floppy Days podcast. I'm Randy Kindig, your host for this ongoing fun look, at least I hope it's fun, back to early computer technology of the late 70s through the 80s. This particular episode has a special meaning for me personally. You see, as I've mentioned in earlier episodes, the TRS-80 Model I from Tandy Radio Shack was my first home computer, even though my first programmable device was actually a TI-58C calculator. I recall the joy and wonder of playing with the machine. It wasn't called the Model I at that time, just the TRS-80 as it was the first of the line. In the local Radio Shack store in 1977 and 78, and the incredible rush of owning one in 79, after my wife purchased a Level 1 basic machine for me as a gift for college graduation. That machine only had 4K of RAM and 4K of ROM, which was tiny basic, as it was the entry-level machine, but it was a thing of beauty. I felt like I could do anything with that machine, even though my justification to the wife was that we could track our checkbook and recipes on it. I think she knew better, but went along with it anyway. The computer came with everything you needed, including a tape drive and black and white monitor, which was good for a poor, recent college graduate. I quickly, as finances allowed with my new engineering job, upgraded the computer to 16K of RAM and a Level 2 Basic, a powerful Microsoft 12K ROM Basic, and enjoyed the machine immensely, even using it in my job, supporting the build-out of a new nuclear power plant back in those days. I eventually sold off the Model I in favor of a computer that had color graphics and sound, the Atari 800, but have always continued to have a huge soft spot for that first computer. When I started the Floppy Days podcast, one of the people that has always been on my bucket list to interview has been Steve Leininger, who, along with Don French, while at Radio Shack, designed the TRS-80 Model I, among other things. A few years back, I had the opportunity to participate in an interview with Steve for the Trash Talk podcast when I was co-hosting that show, but an ill-timed trip to the hospital for my son meant that I was not able to participate. While my son's health is of paramount importance, of course, I always wanted to get another chance to talk with Steve. Not only was Steve the designer of one of my favorite home computers of all time, but he was also a fellow Purdue Boilermaker who graduated just a year before I started there. The thought that I could have met Steve on campus if I'd been there just a year earlier was very intriguing to me and fueled my desire to talk with Steve even more. In the last episode, number 141 with Paul Terrell, I talked about VCF Southeast in Atlanta in July of 2024. After I had made plans to attend that show, I was flabbergasted to find out that Earl Ball, one of the show organizers, had somehow managed to contact Steve and get him to come to the show. I have to thank Earl for the work he did to make that happen. Here was my opportunity to certainly meet Steve and perhaps even talk with him. I prepped some questions just in case I was able to get an interview. While at the show, I met Steve and asked him if he would be willing to do a short interview for Floppy Days while at the show. Amazingly, he was very kind and agreed to do that. We found a quiet room and I was able to talk with Steve for almost an hour. This show contains that interview. Another note on this, as you'll hear in the interview, the connection to Steve is even stronger than I realized. He not only went to my alma mater, but also grew up in some of the same towns that myself and my wife did. We peripherally know some of his relatives. Things like this really do make you think the world is small. One other final note, this interview even ties in to the recent and continuing interviews I've been publishing with Paul Terrell. As you'll hear in upcoming episodes with Paul, and in this interview with Steve, Steve actually worked at the bike shop before getting the first job with Tandy. And in fact, his work at the bike shop directly led him to getting hired by Tandy to design the Model I. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the interview as much as I enjoyed getting it. I am overjoyed I finally got the chance to talk to one of my vintage computer heroes, Steve Leininger. Before we get into that, though, I have a few other things I wanted to cover. First, I wanted to mention a couple of websites, a couple of small companies, small businesses that support our vintage computer hobbies and are great places to get vintage computer items. One is 8bitclassics.com, run by my friend Corey Colts. He has lots of video cables, power supplies, upgrades, and more for a wide variety of vintage computer platforms. I often talk about things I have gotten from Corey from his 8-Bit Classics site. Corey's been a friend of the show for some time, and I really appreciate his support of the podcast. Also, ArcadeShopper.com is another great site to get vintage computer items. This one is run by my friend Greg McGill. Greg has a wide variety of usually hard to find items for a large number of platforms. This is another site I've done a lot of shopping at, and I've mentioned numerous times on the show. Thank you both, Corey and Greg, for your support of Floppy Days. I also want to mention those listeners who also support the show by donating through Patreon.com. I'm very encouraged by the support that I've gotten that way, and it really, really does help in keeping the podcast going, and it helps offset the cost of running the podcast. Okay, now on with the show.
Hi, this is Peter Bartlett, creator of the Model I system expander device for the TRS-80 Model I, and you're listening to Floppy Days.
Okay, now for new acquisitions and what I've been up to. So I managed to acquire some more books. Surprise, surprise. I have more books than I can possibly handle, but I'm always on the lookout for new books. And I have acquired a few here that I wanted to mention. One I actually picked up in a half-price bookstore. I was surprised to find this. It's actually somewhat unusual to find some vintage computer books in the half-price bookstore. This one is called C64 Sketch and Design by Tony Laveau. I think you pronounce it. It's spelled Lavie. It's not quite what I thought it was. I didn't look at it that carefully in the bookstore when I bought it. What it is a workbook for creating sprites, custom characters, screens, and music on the Commodore 64. So it has templates. It's a book just of templates to make it easier to create design elements for your programs. So there are templates for sprites, custom characters, even screen layouts, so that you don't have to create your own sheets to do this. There's 100 templates for sprites, 450 custom characters, 50 screens, and hundreds of notes of music. So that one's a bit unusual, but I'm glad to add it to my collection. Another one, of course, compute books. I always am on the lookout for additional computes books. I love the set of books that they produce for all the different machines. This one was Computes Mapping the IBM PC and PC Junior by Russ Davies. And I found this on Amazon. It was a very reasonable price. Did not have this, so I ordered it. And as you might expect, it has key memory locations for the IBM PC and the PC Junior, since they share a lot of the same key memory locations. And finally, on the book side, an Atari 8-bit book. It's called The Best of Softside Atari Edition. Now, those of you that are not familiar with Softside magazine, it was dedicated to personal computer programming. It had articles and line-by-line listings, program listings that users manually keyed in. It started with a TRS-80 edition launched in '78, and then in 1980 there was an Apple II specific version. And then there were individual versions supporting the Atari 8-bit computers, the IBM PC, as well as one for basic language programmers called Prog-80. And then finally, the platform-specific versions were combined into a single monthly edition in late 1980. The thing I like about this is that it contains a description of each and every Atari 8-bit program that's in there. So there are numerous comments throughout the program listing that really tell you what's going on. Some of them are actual comments in the code, and others are just comments that are in the book. But it really does one of the best jobs I've ever seen of telling you exactly what's happening in the program as you read through the listing. It also, very nicely, has a program that helps to ensure you haven't made typing errors. If you type in the programs, it will generate codes as you type, and then there are codes in the back of the book that you verify against that will tell you if you possibly made key entry errors. So that's very nice as well. So again, the Best of Softside Atari Edition. That's it for books. The next item is something called the ZX81 Plus 38. What this is a ZX81 clone without a ULA built in. It's built entirely from discrete pin-through hole components. It has a PCB with the exact same size as a normal ZX81, has drill holes in the same locations, although the power jack is replaced with a modern Type B USB power jack. It has the RF modulator replaced with a composite video output connector. There's no ULA in this clone. All of the ULA logic is replicated with modern DIP-compatible logic ICs. The cassette loading input logic has been enhanced to give perfect cassette loading behavior as opposed to the original machine. There are also 3D designs available to 3D print a ZX81 case so that you can put it in a 3D printed case, or you can use a real ZX81 case from a defective ZX81. Now, this assembled board was donated by Matthew Spence to the podcast. I really appreciate that. I love the rock solid video that you get out of this board, how it fits into the ZX81, or it can even, with modification to the case, fit in a Timex Sinclair 1000 case. It has built-in 16K and all the other improvements on this, so really nice little clone. The keyboard that Matthew included, he included a real keyboard, and it's absolutely fantastic. So thanks again, Matthew Spence, for your donation to the show. I really love this thing, and it's a nice improvement over the ZX81. Additionally, I got a couple of things that are not themselves vintage, but add to the vintage computing hobby, or are adjacent to the vintage computer hobby, in that it helps support the things that we do with our vintage computers. One is a set of magnifying glasses that I got off of Amazon. I actually saw this being used at one of the local Vintage Computer Club meetings. And it is a rechargeable, hands-free headband magnifying glasses with 2 LEDs and multiple lenses. So it really is a great way to view some of the close work that you need to do on some of these machines, or if you're soldering or whatever. And then additionally, I got a Japanese power adapter. Now I got this because I have a Yamaha MSX computer that has the Japanese plug. And so I got this power adapter that will convert it to a US plug. And again, I got this on Amazon. So that's it for new acquisitions this month.
This is Ian Maverick, aka Mav, from the Trash Talk podcast, and you're listening to the Floppy Days podcast.
Okay, now let's talk about upcoming shows for the remainder of 2024. As of this recording, the one that is coming up next, the big one of the year, this has got to be the largest vintage computer show in existence, possibly the largest ever. VCF Midwest, which occurs September 7th through the 8th. This year they moved to a new location, a much larger location. I understand it's 50,000 square feet of vintage computer goodness at the Renaissance Schaumburg Convention Center in Schaumburg, Illinois. Obviously, I am planning to be there. I will have a table for Floppy Days and Antic and have a computer set up, and hope to meet some of you that I have not met, or see other people that, I have met before but haven't seen for a while. Sometimes these shows are the only times that I see some people. So anyway, I'm really looking forward to this show, trying to get things prepared for it. Not quite sure what I'm going to bring yet, but if you're not going to be at this show, I understand you can't always make these shows, but if we're going to make one show a year, this is probably the one. At the same time, VCF Europe will be going on. This was delayed, but it ended up being at the same time, September 7th through the 8th, in Munich, Germany. I understand there's going to be a link set up between the two shows, so any times that overlap, now Germany obviously is on a different time zone, any times that overlap, there will be the opportunity for you to actually talk to people that are in VCF Europe. So that's kind of cool. September 14th through the 15th will be the World of Retro Computing 2024 Expo in Canada, Kitchener, Ontario, Canada. The next weekend, Teletext 50, September 21st through the 22nd, at the Centre for Computing History in Cambridge, UK. Portland Retro Gaming Expo, September 27th through the 29th at the Oregon Convention Center in Portland, Oregon. Same weekend and I will be at this show, Tandy Assembly, again, September 27th through the 29th at the Courtyard by Marriott, Springfield, Ohio. So again, I will have a table there for Floppy Days, have some Tandy equipment set up on my table, and really look forward to that show. My wife and I actually both look forward to going to that show, and it's only a couple hours from where I live near Indianapolis. Hope to see you there. Amy West, October 25th through the 27th. This is an Amiga show in Sacramento, California. The Chicago TI International World Fair covers the TI 99-4A computer. It's October 26th at the Evanston Public Library in Evanston, Illinois. The Retro Computer Festival 2024, November 9th through the 10th, at the Center for Computing History in Cambridge, England. And finally, to round out the year, Silly Venture Winter Edition, December 5th through the 8th in Gdańsk, Poland. So there you go. There's the shows that I know of for the remainder of this year. This schedule, the schedule for the entire year, is published at the Floppy Days website. So you can go there and get the information. Obviously, the ones I just talked about will also be in this show's show notes. But take a look and try to get out to one or more shows. They're really a lot of fun. That's it for upcoming shows for 2024.
Hi, this is Miles Wake, vintage computer enthusiast out of Phoenix, Arizona, and you're listening to Floppy Days.
Okay, now to the relatively new segment that I've recently decided to include in Floppy Days, and that is the Meet the Listeners segment. And this month, we're going to meet Marshall Walker.
Hi, this is Marshall Walker. My introduction into the world of computers and video games came one Christmas morning when my family unwrapped an Atari 2600. My brothers and I were instantly hooked, spending hours trying to beat each other's scores on classics like Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, Centipede, Adventure, a whole bunch of others. But it just wasn't about the games. It was the start to something bigger in my life. I got my first taste of home computing during visits to my cousins. My uncle had a complete Commodore 64 setup, and then I was blown away by how much better the games looked and sounded compared to our 2600. I didn't want to leave, but they had to kick me out, of course. But then came Christmas 1983, and to my surprise, we got an Atari 800 XL computer with an Indus GT disk drive. It was a dream come true. I found out that another uncle had bought the same setup for my cousins nearby. So every visit turned into a chance to play more games and show off whatever new tricks I've learned and to show them how to do different things. It was great. One memory that stands out is when I discovered Compute magazine. I was at the grocery store with my mom, and when a colorful cover caught my eye, it was Compute magazine. It was the February 1985 issue. I convinced my mom to buy it, and I couldn't wait to get home to show my dad and to start typing in the program they featured that month called Acrobat. My dad and I spent hours entering lines of basic code, saving frequently to avoid losing our work. But when we finally typed run for the very first time, all we got was an error message. It was so frustrating. Well, put the disk back in the back of the disk holder and kept on going with other games and other things in our lives. Well, next month rolled around and I saw the new issue of Compute. And back in the back of the magazine was their little section called Compute. When I looked through there was a little thing about Acrobat and that there was an error in some of the lines of code. I was thrilled when my mom bought me the magazine, and that afternoon my dad and I sat back down in front of the computer and changed the code held our breath, saved, of course, and then typed run one more time. This time, it worked. The colors changed, the graphics appeared, and suddenly the computer was making these odd sounds. We never experienced anything like that before from a typed-in game. We plugged in a joystick, pressed the fire button, and we were amazed with how smooth things were moving on the screen. My dad and I have successfully typed in our very first huge basic program that was more complex than just like the simple hello world that everybody does when they first get their first computer. It was a great achievement for both of us. Moving on, my love for computers grew even more when I attended my first computer club meeting with Eon, the 8-bit only network for Atari enthusiasts. We were just a small group of meeting in the library basement, but there was where I really got into the nitty-gritty of computers, hardware, and games with the systems. Another group, LACE, the Latent Atari computer enthusiast, introduced me to even more, including my first encounter with the Atari ST. That machine blew me away because, again, it was looking better than the 2600 and also the 8-bit, and I became a fan for life. Around that time, I also discovered modems. Lace mentioned that they had their own little BBS, and starting with the XM301 300 baud modem I got for my birthday one year. From there, I was hooked onto BBSs and never really gotten off the internet since. During my childhood, one of my friends was also deep into computers. He also had an 8-bit system just like me. We met in junior high, and while he was programming Genius, filling out notebooks with lines of basic code for his latest game creations, I was the one determined to conquer the games. So he went on to work for tech giants like Microsoft, Amazon, and Netflix, which was really impressive. And while I stayed more on the gaming side and electronic side of things. So today, I'm still into retro computing, probably more than ever. With the disposable income, of course, my collection of Atari hardware and software has grown beyond what I ever imagined, and I'm on a mission to preserve history. What I'm currently doing for anybody and everybody is I've been archiving floppy disks and whatnot. I believe I've done over at least 10,000 using just various means of preserving the software, and I'm hoping to keep these memories alive, providing copies of whatever I have to anybody, sharing on archive.org or Atari Mania, Atari Age, so on and so forth. I just feel good about keeping this preservation alive. With that, been also into modifying all the old retro systems. I've mostly done just Atari hardware, but things like the Ultimate 1 Meg, disk drive modifications, FujiNet, which has been an awesome tool to use, driving me back to just playing classic games and learning new things once again. I appreciate your time and listening to some of my fondest memories from growing up, and the love for these machines has never faded, and I'm excited to keep the retro computing spirit alive for years to come. Thanks again for listening.
Okay, and now for the interview with one of the true pioneers of home computing, Mr. Steve Leininger. All right. Well, I really appreciate your time today, Steve.
Well, thank you for having me, Randy.
So let's start out maybe just by talking about where you live today and what you do.
Well, I live in Woodland Park, Colorado, which is 8,500 feet right out in front of, we got Pikes Peak out our front window.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, we get snow up through about June, and then it starts again about September. But it's not as much snow as you would imagine.
I've got property in Montana, and I lived out there for a couple of years.
Well, there you go.
So we probably got more snow up there.
And you asked what I did. So I'm involved with Boy Scouts, a makerspace, with a church based ministry, firewood ministry, actually. Some people call it a fire bank. So we provide firewood to people who can't afford that.
Oh.
So it's like a food bank, but with firewood.
I've never heard of that.
We source the firewood. We cut it down. We split it. lots of volunteers involved. Pretty big project.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So, also wanted to mention, I'm a fellow Boilermaker.
There you go.
I know you went to Purdue, right?
I did go to Purdue.
Do you ever get back there?
Yeah, and in fact, they've got a couple learning spaces named after us.
Oh, okay.
We've been donating to our respective alma maters. My wife went to IU.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Oh my.
Yeah. Oh my, indeed. The fact that the family, who's all IU, their family, tolerated me was, quite a remarkable thing.
Okay. Well, I find it interesting because I think you graduated in like 76?
74.
Oh, 74.
Yeah. I was there from...
Oh, you actually were gone before I started.
Yeah, so I was there from 70 to 73, 70 to 74 when I graduated. In 4 years, I got both my bachelor's and master's degree by going through the summer. And
right.
I managed to pass out of the first year classes because of
some of the classes you got in high school.
High school stuff. So
yeah. Okay, I started in 75, so I guess we just missed each other.
Yeah, you're the new kids coming in.
Yeah. So I found that interesting, and I wanted to say that. Do you keep up with their sports program or anything like that?
Yeah. They play a pretty good game of basketball.
Yeah, I know.
And in fact, I kind of ribbed my wife about it because she was from the earlier days, the Bobby Knight days at IU that were phenomenal.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So. And for those of you listening, I'm talking with Steve Leininger, who was, I guess, the primary developer, if not the developer, of the TRS-80 Model I.
I did all the hardware and software for it. I'll give Don French credit for sticking to it and getting a project started.
Yeah.
And for refining our product definition a little bit to where it was better than it would have been if I would have stopped early.
Okay. And I have talked with Don before. I've interviewed him on the podcast, and I met him at Tandy Assembly. But I'm just curious, when you were hired into Tandy and you were told what you were going to do, exactly what were you told, I guess?
Well, they had a 16-bit microprocessor board that another consultant had developed.
Okay.
And they were trying to make a personal computer out of this. It was the Pace microprocessor, which was not a spectacular success for National, but it was one of the first 16-bit processors. But they had basically an initial prototype. It might have been even the second level of the thing. No real documentation, no software. Ran on 3 different voltages. Didn't have input or output. Other than that, it was fine. So,
other than that,
yeah. So, I was brought in because I was one of the engineers for the development board series for the SCAMP, the SCMP that National Semiconductor had, very low cost microprocessor that. At one point in time, I benchmarked against the 8080 with positive benchmarks. I mean, ours was faster on the benchmarks I put together, but as I was later told, there's lies, damn lies, and benchmarks. So they said, well, take a look at using their low-cost microprocessor that you were working with, and it really wasn't the right answer for the job. So the Altair was already out. Okay, right. That was the first real personal computer. The Apple I was out. Okay, but it was not a consumer computer. Okay, it was like a cookie sheet of parts. which was very similar to what was used in the Atari games at the commercial games, Pong and that kind of stuff at that time. And so I had been working, after Purdue, I went to National Semiconductor. There's sort of a long story behind all that. But in the process, some of us engineers would go up to the Homebrew Computer Club that met monthly up at the Stanford Linear Accelerator. I mean, we're talking Wilbur and Orville Wright kinds of things going on. Everyone who was in the pioneering version of computing had at one time been to that meeting.
Right, it's very famous, yeah.
Yeah. So Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were basically a couple guys working out of their garage at the time. I was still working at National Semiconductor, but I also had a moonlight job at Byte Shop number 2, the second computer store in all of California. And so...
so you worked with Paul Terrell.
I actually worked with Paul. I actually worked for Paul's. I don't know if it was a partner, Todd. I don't even remember the last name.
Okay,
but it was.
I was curious because I'm talking to Paul right now and getting interviews.
I'm sure we met, but it wasn't anything horribly formal. Since it was the number 2 shop, it still wasn't the number 1 shop, which Paul worked out of.
Right.
And so we had an Apple one there. I actually got the job because when I went in there, they were trying to troubleshoot something with it looked like an oscilloscope that they pulled out of a tank, and so it had audio level kind of bandwidth, but could not do a digital circuit. And I said, well, what you really need is and told them, a good Tektronix scope or something like that. And they said, well, do you want a job here? And I ended up, moonlighting there, which was, as fortune would have it, was a good deal when the folks from Radio Shack came down to visit. Because when they came down to visit, the sales guy wasn't there, so we'll let the engineer talk to them. They almost never let the engineers talk to them.
So you got to talk with them.
Yeah. Well, it was John Roach, Don French, and it was probably Jack Sellers. Okay. Don was probably he was the most on top of stuff electronically because he was a hobbyist of sorts. The other two guys, Mr. Sellers ran the engineering group. John Roach was the VP of manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
And they were basically on a parts visit. They do it once a year, twice a year. And they also did it with Motorola and a couple other places. But I told them about this microprocessor and that I was writing a Tiny Basic for it. Okay, Tiny Basic was a interpreted BASIC that a guy named Lai Chen Wang actually had the first thing in Dr. Dobbs magazine. I mean, we're talking about we're talking about things that you don't realize are the shoulders of giants that turned out to be the shoulders of giants. And in fact, we reached out to Mr. Wang as we were working on. We thought we had the software already taken care of because I'm kind of jumping ahead in the story, but we were going to have Bob Uterick, and you'd have to chase that back. We had him signed up to write a BASIC interpreter for us, but because he'd already done one for the 6800. And it was included in Interface Age magazine on a plastic record. You remember the old plastic records? You could put it in a magazine?
Yeah, I did see that.
Yeah, so this was called a floppy ROM when they did it.
Yeah.
So if you had the right software and everything, you could download the software off of the floppy ROM and run it on 6800. I think he used the Southwest Technical Products thing. And so we'd signed him up to do the BASIC. This was independent of the hardware design I was doing. And he went into radio silence on us. Couldn't find him. And so we got to, in parallel, I was using the Leichen Wang plan to do at least a demo version of BASIC that would run on the original computer. And when the demo went successfully on Groundhog Day in 1977, so I mean, this is the time frame we're talking about. I started work on July 5th, the year before.
With Tandy?
Yeah.
Okay.
We rolled into town on the 3rd, and of course they're closed for the 4th. And on the 5th I started, and there was the wandering around in the desert at the beginning of that. And Don's probably talked about how I was moved from there to their audio factory and then to the old saddle factory. You know, the Tandy used to be primarily a leather company before they bought Radio Shack in 1966 or something like that. And so, anyway, when the software didn't come out, I ended up writing the software too. So I designed all the hardware and all the software. I didn't do the power supply. Chris Klein did the power supply, and a little bit of the analog video circuitry, but it was very little part of that because we were just making a video signal. I did all the digital stuff on that.
Yeah. So the software ended up being what was the level 1 ROM, right?
The level 1 ROM started out as the Leichen Wang BASIC. But he had no I/O in his software. You know, so I was doing the keyboard scanning. I had to do the cassette record and playback. Had to implement data read and data write. Peek and poke, which is pretty simple. Put in the graphic statements. And floating point.
Oh.
Now, floating point, luckily Zilog had a library for that. But I had to basically, this was before APIs were a big deal, so I basically had to use their interface to what I had written and had to allocate storage correct. You know, we're talking about 4K bytes of ROM.
I know. Yeah.
Very tiny.
Yeah.
And to put all the I/O in there and to make it so that you could be updating the screen. You know, when you're doing the cassette, I'd put 2 asterisks up there and blink the second one on and off. You remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Sort of as a level set.
Yeah.
And someone said, "Oh, you should have patented that thing." You know, and actually I have like 7 or 8 patents, U.S. patents, on different parts of the computer architecture, but not the blinking asterisk, which is probably a patentable feature.
Yeah, I wish I'd had that on other machines, you know, that I ended up having, so that would have been nice, yeah. So I liken what you've done with what Steve Wozniak did, you know, for the Apple II. You're somebody I've always wanted to talk to because I felt like you were one of the, you know, important pioneers in the early years. What do you have to say about that? I mean, do you feel like what you did was...
Well, in retrospect, yes. Yeah. You know, and I have a greater appreciation for people like the Wright brothers. You know, if you think about the Wright brothers, they took all their stuff from their Dayton, Ohio bicycle shop down to Kill Devil Hills, we now know it as Kitty Hawk. But they would take the stuff down there by train, and then they would have to put it in horse-driven wagons. Think about that. I mean, you know, you go, well, and so, and people would ask them, you know, what are you going to use the airplane for? It's like, what are you going to use a home computer for? Well, yeah, to maintain recipes and to, you know, play games.
Do your checkbook.
Home security. You know, there's a whole lot of stuff that we talked about.
Right.
And as other giants entered the field, Multiplan, which became Lotus 123, which became XL. Not the same company, but the idea,
Right.
Could you live without a spreadsheet today? Very difficult for some things, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's ubiquitous. I mean, people use it for everything. Yeah. So you've been I talked with David and Teresa Welsh. Where they did the book Priming the Pump.
That's a very that's pretty close to the real thing.
Is it? Okay. And they named their book after what you did and said, what you did kind of primed the pump for home computers. Can you expand on that and tell us exactly what you meant by that? Well,
it again goes back to that shoulders of giants thing,
Yeah.
And I forget who said that. It was, it's actually a very old quote. I can see further because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, and I think the thing that we brought to the table and independently, Commodore and Apple did the same thing in 1977. There were 3 computers that came out inexpensive enough that you could use them in the home. They all came with ROM loaded BASIC. You didn't have to load anything else in. They all came with a video output. Some had displays, some Commodore's was built in, ours was a clip-on, and you had to go find one for the Apple.
Yeah.
Apple had a superior case. Apple and Radio Shack both had great keyboards.
Mm-hmm. Apple was really expandable, I guess, with this.
Yeah, Apple was internally expandable, yeah, but it cost $1,000
right
without the cassette,
right, without
the monitor. So it wasn't the same type of device.
I was a college student, and I looked at all 3 options. And it's like, well, the TRS-80, Radio Shacks everywhere. You could go in and play with one,
yeah,
which was nice, and they were inexpensive enough that I could actually afford one. So
well, and Radio Shack can't duck the if you did something wrong, you had to fix it.
Right.
So
that's right. Let's see here. So initially, the idea was to have a kit computer by Tandy, right?
Yeah. I'm not sure whose idea that was. I mean, it kind of made some kind of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the way the Altair was, and Radio Shack did sell a number of kits. But in the process of still kicking that around, saying, well, it could be a possibility. I was one of the ones that said, well, it could be a possibility. Within the same group that I did the design work from, they also would take kits in that people had built and troubleshoot the things if they didn't work. We had a couple engineers that would, all right, you connected something wrong or something, you didn't. And sometimes it was a matter that the instructions weren't clear. I mean, if you tell someone to put an LED in, well, you specifically have to tell them which way to put it in. And
might be an opportunity to tweak your
yeah. So anyway, we got this clock in, and one of the it was a digital clock, so 7-segment LEDs, probably cost $50 or more, which is crazy. But it says put all the components in the board, turn the board over, and solder everything to the board, and pretty simple instructions. This had a sheet of solder over the entire bottom of the board. Someone figured out how to put 2 pounds of solder on the back of this thing, and as we got a great chuckle out of that, you realize, oh, you don't want to have to deal with a computer like this. You really don't.
Yeah.
And so Lou Kornfeld, who was the president at the time, didn't really want the computer, but he said it's not going to be a kit. All right.
That took
great idea.
That. Yeah.
Great idea.
Were there any other times when you thought the computer might, or were there any times, I guess, when you thought the computer might not come to fruition? Any snags that you hit that made you think that, well, maybe this isn't going to work?
Not really. I was young and pretty well undaunted.
Pretty sure you could.
Yeah.
Get
Well, it wasn't any. It wasn't any different than building one at home. I'd been building kits since night kits, Heath kits, that kind of stuff since I was a kid, and homebrewed a couple things, including a hot dog cooker made from 2 nails and a couple wires that plugged into the wall. Don't try that at home.
No kidding.
But it's kind of funny if you look that kind of project up on the internet, you can still find a project like that. It's like what's it called? Anvil tossing, where you put gunpowder under an anvil and shoot it up in the air. What could possibly go wrong?
Right.
So don't, yike.
It's very well documented in books like Priming the Pump, Stan Veit's book, which I assume you're familiar with, and Fire in the Valley, what your involvement was with the Model I. But there was some mention of your involvement with the expansion interface and other TRS-80 projects. What else did you work on while you were there?
The color computer, the expansion interface, the Model 3 to a little bit. The Model 2 was the big one. At a certain point, I just got tired of the management there.
Did you? Okay.
Yeah. My mind was going faster than theirs, and they made the conscious decision to do whatever IBM has done, but do it cheaper. Well, that to me, that's not a. They didn't say less expensively either. So the whole thing just kind of troubled me that, we're not going to be able to do anything new unless IBM has done it. And at about the same time, the Macintosh came out, and superb piece of work.
Okay. What education, training, and previous work experience did you have at the time you got hired by Tandy that made you uniquely qualified for that project that they were looking for?
Well, I've been playing around with electronics since I was in the 3rd grade. Actually, electricity.
Since the 3rd grade, wow.
Yeah. My mom got me a kit that had light bulbs and bells and buzzers and wire from, I think it might have been the Metropolitan Museum. They had a kit. They still today have a online presence. Of course, the materials have changed, but the kit had all these parts, and it had no instructions. And I don't know if that was by design or it didn't have instructions. So I had to learn how to hook up wires and light bulbs and bells and switches to make it do things. And in the process, I found out that if you put a wire right across the battery terminals, it gets hot. Interesting stuff to know. Pretty soon I was taking this stuff into show and tell in the 3rd grade. And
that was very early in electronics, so I'm sure.
Well, it's electricity, yeah.
Yeah.
And then my mom would take me to the library. She was quite a voracious reader, and I'd go to the technical section, specifically the Dewey Decimal 621, which was electronics and things like that. And
you still remember that?
Well, yeah. And in the 590 series, there's some good stuff too. And I would usually take out a stack of books, even though I was a horrible reader, because I'm dyslexic and ADD. So I have a attention span and reading problem. But the technical stuff, I was reading about pipeline architecture processors while I was still in junior high. And not that was important to where I ended up, but it was important because I understood the words and data flow and stuff like that.
Sure.
And so between that and the building of kits and things like that, when we moved to Indianapolis, my dad moved jobs down to Indianapolis.
Oh, you live in Indianapolis?
Yeah. So I moved from South Bend down to Indianapolis. So I probably passed your houses.
Possibly.
Well, actually, we came down through Kokomo, but yeah.
Well, I actually grew up in that part of the state.
Okay.
Just south of South Bend.
Okay. So yeah, La Paz, Plymouth,
Yeah, Warsaw, Rochester.
Yeah, well, I was born in Rochester.
Oh, okay.
So
well, that's where I grew up, in that area.
That's there you go. And my dad's from Akron.
Are you serious?
I am serious.
Akron is where my wife grew up.
Okay.
And I was just 10 miles from there.
The general store there, Dan Leininger and Sons. That's my great-great-grandfather.
Really?
Yeah.
I'll be darned. Okay.
So now it all makes sense.
That's amazing.
So anyway, we started a garage band. This was before Apple's garage band, and I made my own amplifier. It was it basically had the Sun amplifiers back end on the thing and a Fender Showman front end on it. So completely homebrewed, really loud amplifier. And had a friend who had a guitar amplifier that was broken, and he'd taken it down to a music store there. And after 6 weeks of not getting it back, they said, well, we've had trouble with our technician and all that. I asked if I could go down and look at it. And in 15 minutes, I had his amplifier fixed. And they said, do you want a job? All right, well, yeah. Because I'd been doing, I'd had a paper route before, and I don't think I was doing anything since we'd moved. And so I started working in a music store. And they ended up with 2 music stores and then a organ store next door, and I started repairing that kind of stuff. And this was into my first year in college. Went to the extension in Indianapolis.
Oh, okay.
And
was that IUPUI?
UAPUI, yeah. IUPUI.
I went there as well.
Yeah, and so learned Fortran there, got all my first year classes out, and then moved on up to the campus. And because we'd always go to the library, and because my mom would often take me to the newsstand, not too far from the library, and she'd get a couple magazines, but she let me get an electronic magazine. And I didn't understand these things, but pretty soon you start understanding the pic. You start understanding it. This is a resistor. I built a little shocker box based on a design in probably elementary electronics, and it's kind of like a handheld electric fence.
Oh wow!
Yeah. Think hot dog cooker. Anyway, so I learned some electronics that way. A lot of that was self-taught. Learned quite a bit more by working in the music store. Again, this was before I was taught any formal electronics. And actually, when I moved up to campus on Purdue, I thought I was going to be a world-class guitar amplifier designer. That's where I thought. And turns out my analog gut feelings weren't as good as other people's. Paul Schreiber does a much better job with analog electronics than I do. But digital electronics, I understood this stuff. I would hang out in the library and I'd read the trade magazines. So I was way more up to date than a typical professor would be on current electronics. And in 1973, which was the end of my junior year, Electronics Magazine had an article on the Intel 8008. And I said, oh, I understand this. Well, see, I'd already been taking assembly language. Now, they didn't teach assembly language programming in the electronics school.
Yeah.
They had Fortran, but there was no way to get from Fortran to, they just weren't teaching programming languages. I had to go to the business school where I learned assembly language on the school's CDC 6600 mainframe.
Really?
Yeah.
Through the business school.
Yeah, yeah. And so for those of you who have never tried assembly language programming, it looks like a foreign language until you just internalize it in your brain. There's add, ADD, and ADC for add with carry. Right. And there's a whole bunch of different things. There's different ways to move data around, but you're only doing a few really basic things.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you do it fast enough, it looks like it's instantaneous. That's the way even your phone works today. It's because you're doing it fast enough that it fools you.
Do you ever look back at those days with amazement as far as how far the industry has come?
Oh yeah. Well, and it's kind of funny because you couldn't probably, but you wouldn't start over again. I mean, I had to learn digital video. Actually, the giant whose shoulders I stood on there was the late Don Lancaster. He had a book called TV Typewriter Cookbook.
Right.
And actually that came out a little bit later, but he had a TV typewriter series in Radio Electronics Magazine. And basically alphanumeric display. If you think about it, just the glass teletype, the keyboard display and a serial interface, at the time that the Radio Shack computer came out, was selling for $999. Another $400 on top of what we were selling the whole computer for.
Right.
Because we had a microprocessor in there, we didn't have a whole lot of options. We didn't have a whole lot of fluff. In fact, Motorola said, well, send us your schematics and your parts list, and let's see if we can, minimize your circuit. And after 2 weeks, they sent it back and said, well, you did a pretty good job here.
Okay. You still stay in touch with people at Tandy? Or
a few of them. It's actually been more lately because it's almost more interesting now. It's like I don't know whatever happened to Atwater and Kent of the Atwater Kent radio. But, that's an old school radio that now you've got people that, rebuild them and got them all polished up and all this kind of stuff. But for a while, they ended up in the dump. I'm sure, there's some trash 80s that ended up in the trash.
I'm
too.
sure.
Yeah,
sure there were.
But I've gotten rid of lots of PCs that don't meet my needs anymore, right?
Sure. Yeah, we all have. Yeah, somewhere along the way. It seemed like you were really quiet there for a long time. You were difficult to get in contact with.
I wasn't really that difficult. I didn't maintain a social media presence on the thing, but things that I had my own consulting company for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
I actually came back to Radio Shack 2 more times after I left. One was to come back as a technologist there, but the politics still didn't work out well. And then I came back as a contractor to help them with some of their online things. I actually had a website called Steve's Workbench, and you can find it on the Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine.
Right.
And it had some basic stamp projects, and we were going to do all sorts of other things, but I managed to upset the people at RadioShack.com. They didn't have a big sense of humor about someone being critical about the products that they'd selected. And I was going to start doing product reviews on the kits, how easy it was to solder and whether it was a good value for the money and all that kind of stuff. And I gave a pretty honest review on it. And Radio Shack didn't appreciate the power of an honest review. It's what makes Amazon what it is, right? You go in there, and if there's something that's got just 2 stars on the reviews, you really got to know what you're doing if you're going to buy the thing.
Right.
And if you see something that's got a bunch of 1-star and a bunch of 5-star reviews, someone's probably salting the reference at the top end.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, they had such a fit that when they changed platforms for RadioShack.com, they didn't take Steve's Workbench with it, and I basically lost that position. Okay. Radio Shack should own the makerspace business right now. They at one time I suggested, well, you ought to take a look at buying DigiKey or maybe Mouser. Mouser was kind of right down the street from us. They already had their hands into Allied, but these other two were doing stuff more consumer oriented. But they didn't. They were making. They were flush with money from selling cell phone contracts, and they thought that was the way of the future until the cell phone companies start reeling that back in. I mean, at a certain point, you don't want to be paying your 5% or 10% royalty to Radio Shack for just signing someone up.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't realize you had ever gone back and worked for them again.
Yeah, twice. But, and so.
So I'm curious, did you meet any other famous figures in the microcomputer revolution while you were working at Tandy?
At Tandy, let's see.
Or just period.
Well, yeah, Bill Gates, of course. I went out. I went out when we were working on level 2 basic.
Okay.
And Bill Gates, I think, was probably 100,000-aire at that time.
Yeah. Right.
and working in they had a floor in a bank building in Seattle. He took me to the basement of his dad's law firm, and we had drinks there. And I went out to his house on the lake. This was not the big house. I've never been there. It was a big house on the lake, but it wasn't the one that he built later on.
Okay.
So I knew him early on. Run across Forrest Mims a couple times.
Okay.
And of course, he's the shoulders upon which a lot of electronic talent was built.
Yeah.
And some of the stuff is lost. Jameco's actually bringing him back as a. Jameco is a kind of like a Radio Shack store online. It's not as robust as DigiKey or Mouser, but they've held their roots. Someone I've not met, Lady Ada from Adafruit would be kind of fun.
Yeah. Would, yeah.
That's another thing that, if we had something along those lines, that would have been cool.
Uh-huh.
But the buyers weren't up to the task, and they, when you don't want criticism, well, at a certain point, you got to quit doing things if you don't want to be criticized.
When you finally got the Model 1 rolled out and you saw the tremendous interest, were you surprised in the interest that it
I wasn't.
garnered?
I wasn't. In fact, there's a quote of me. Me and John Roach had a discussion on how many of these do you think we could sell, and this is actually quoted in his obituary in the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Tandy said, well, you could build 3,500 of these because we've got 3,500 stores, and we could use them in the inventory.
Right.
And to take inventory. And John Roach thought, well, maybe we could sell up to 5,000 of these things in the first year. And I said, oh, no, I think we could sell 50,000. To which he said, horse shit. Just like that. And that, now I quoted that to the Wall Street Journal, and they put that in his obituary. You know, so I don't know how many times that word shows up in the Wall Street Journal, but if you search their files, you'll find that it was me quoting John Roach. So
I'll have to look for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's funny. So you were not surprised by the interest, I guess. Yeah.
Well, no, and you know, part of it was I knew the leverage of the stores. You know, when we introduced the thing, I'd been working for the company for just over a year.
Yeah.
Think about that. And it wasn't until just before, it was probably September or October when Don and I agreed on the specs. I'd keep writing it up, and he'd look at it. And, Don actually demanded. Yeah, he doesn't. But in a good-natured way. He made a good case for it. That I have, in addition to the cassette interface on there, that I have a way to read and write data. Because if you're going to do an accounting program, you got to be able to read and write data. So I actually figured out a way, to do that. There were a couple other things. John Roach really wanted blinking lights on the thing, and my mechanical designer there said, "Well, that's going to cost more money to put the LEDs in there. And what are you going to do with them?" And well, Mr. Roach was, familiar with the IBM, probably the 360 by then. Anyway,
the mainframes.
Mainframes always had blinking lights on them.
Exactly.
And so since it's a computer, it should have blinking lights. So Larry the mechanical guy said, "Well, what are you going to do with them?" I said, "I can't. I said I could put stuff up there, but it's."
What are they going to indicate?
Yeah. And then he said, "I'll tell you what. I'm going to make the case without holes for the lights, and just don't worry about it." That was sort of the end of the discussion. Mr. Roach was probably a little disappointed, but no one else had them. So
it's funny to think that you'd have blinking lights on a microcomputer like that. Is there any aspect of the Model 1 development you would do differently if you were doing it today?
I would have put the 8th memory chip in with the video display, so you get upper and lower case.
Yeah, there you go. Okay.
Might have put buffers to the outside world. We had the microprocessor was buffered, but it was very short distance off the connector there. Otherwise, there's not a whole lot I would have changed. Software could have been written a little better, but when one person's writing all the software, the development system that I had was a Zilog development system. So, and a 30 character per second decorator line printer. So, the fact that I got it done is actually miracle stuff.
And you got it done in a year, right?
And it was all written in assembly language. Yeah. So, got it all done in a year.
That's a good year's work.
It is.
Building a computer from scratch, basically, and
then and back then we had to program EPROMs.
Yeah.
We didn't have flash memory. Okay, so didn't hardly have operating systems back then. Not that I was using one. There was something in the Zilog thing, but we were so far ahead of things. We were developing a product rather than a computer, and maybe that's the whole difference. Is that we had a product that you pull it out, plug it in, right, and it says TRS-80, and it wasn't the Model 1 until the Model 2 came out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was just
we got to play again.
Just the TRS-80.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have to know, do you have any of the old hardware from
I've got a Model 1.
Okay.
I don't use it except for demonstrations now. I actually have two. I've got one that works and one that's probably got a broken keyboard connector from taking it out of the case and holding it up too many times.
Were these prototypes or anything, or just?
They are non-serial production units.
Gotcha.
I've got a prototype ROM board that's got the original integer BASIC that I wrote.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the video boards and all that kind of stuff that went with it when we did the original demonstration. Let's see. We had 4 completely wire-wrapped, industrial wire-wrapped versions that we used for prototyping the software. One went to David Leon, who wrote the book that came with the thing, the basic book.
Right.
One I had at my desk, and there were 2 others, and they got rid of all of those. So a cautionary tale is if you do something in the future where you've got that prototype that was put together in Tupperware containers or held together with duct tape, you need to at least take pictures of it, and you might want to keep one aside. If it turns out to be something like the Apple III, you can probably get rid of all that stuff. If it turns out to be something like the Apple II, the Radio Shack computer, the Commodore PET, you really ought to enshrine that. The original iPhone. Apple did stuff that was, what was it? Can't remember what it was. They had a thing not unlike the PDAs. No one knows what a personal
PDA,
digital assistant. Yeah. Well, we call that a phone.
Palm Pilot.
Yeah. Palm Pilot. That's the one.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of those. I've got 3 Model 100s. I've got one of the early.
Did you work on the 100s?
I used it, but I didn't work on it.
I mean the design.
No.
Okay.
That was an NEC product with Radio Shack skins on it.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Kei Nishi was the big mover on that.
Yeah.
Let's see. I've got an Altair and a ASR 33 teletype. So
cool.
Yeah, we're talking about maybe the computer's grandfather, right?
Right.
I've had a whole bunch of other stuff. I've probably had 40 other computers that I don't have anymore. I am gravitating towards mechanical music devices, big music boxes, that kind of stuff.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Steve, that's all the questions I had prepared. Is there anything I should have asked about that?
Oh, my.
Or anything you'd want to say?
I've given talks before on, how do you innovate? How do you become,
right.
This is pioneering kinds of stuff. So you really have to have that vision. And the vision, I can't exactly say where the vision comes from, but being dyslexic for me has been a gift. Okay. And this is something I tell grade school and middle school students that, some people are out there saying, well, I can't do that because, it's just too much stuff or my brain is cluttered. Well, if a cluttered desk is the sign of a cluttered mind, what's an empty desk the sign of? So, embrace the clutter. Learn a lot of different things. Do what you're passionate about. Be willing to support your arguments. Don't just get angry if someone doesn't think the way you do. Explain why you're doing it that way. And sometimes it's a matter they just don't like it or they don't have the vision. The ones that don't have the vision, they may never have the vision. I've quit companies because of people like that.
Mm-hmm.
But when you've got the vision and can take it off in your direction, it could just end up as being art. Well, and I shouldn't say just art. You know, art can be an amazing thing, and you see that behind these walls here. We've got a pinball machine and gaming conference going on,
right?
And it is nutcase. So, but is there stuff out there you look at and say, "Oh wow"? Yeah, and I do too. So keep that old wow going.
Very cool. All right, that's a great stopping point, I think.
All right.
I really appreciate it, Steve, taking the time to talk with us today.
Thanks, Randy.
All right, that's it for the podcast for this month. I want to give out special thanks to Steve Leininger for taking his time at VCF Southeast to talk with me. I really appreciate it, and again, this is an interview I've always wanted to get, so made my day. All of the information that we talked about during this podcast is listed in the show notes. Just go to floppydays.com for the full list. I very much encourage you to provide feedback for the show at Apple Podcasts, or you can do it on the website. You can also do it via email at floppydays@gmail.com, via Twitter at floppydays, or on Mastodon at floppydays@oldbytes.space, or on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/floppydays. Another option is the Discord server, whose link is at floppydays.com. And besides the website and Apple Podcasts, Floppy Days is available for streaming on a lot of places, such as TuneIn, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Spotify. Until the next show, pull out a vintage computer and compute as if it were yesterday. Bye!